In 1932, the Australian military declared war on birds, not metaphorically, actual war. They deployed soldiers, machine guns, and 10,000 rounds of ammunition against emus in Western Australia. The emus won. This is the story of humanity's most embarrassing military defeat, and 98 other facts that somehow get stranger. Before we dive in, comment where in the world you're watching from, and don't forget to click subscribe. Let's talk about November 1932, when the Australian government decided that large, flightless birds represented a military threat serious enough to deploy the army. This wasn't a joke. This wasn't a training exercise. This was Australia looking at emus eating crops in Western Australia and deciding the appropriate response was artillery-grade firepower and soldiers with combat experience from World War I. The fact that this actually happened is weird enough. The fact that the emus basically won makes it legendary. But the truly bizarre part is that nobody learns about this in history class, even though it's one of the most perfectly absurd moments in modern military history. It's got everything. Incompetent leadership, overconfident predictions, an enemy that literally cannot understand it's supposed to lose, and a conclusion that makes everyone involved look ridiculous. So, here's fact number 1. The Great Emu War of 1932 was a real military operation, with official government sanction, military personnel, and artillery weapons deployed against approximately 20,000 emus in the Campion district of Western Australia. Not pest control, not a hunting expedition. An actual military operation with command structure and official reports filed to the Australian Parliament. Fact number 2. The soldier chosen to lead this operation was Major G.P.W. Meredith, a decorated World War I veteran who'd faced actual combat against actual human enemies with actual military training. Meredith showed up to fight emus with 2 soldiers, 2 Lewis guns, which are light machine guns that fire 500 rounds per minute, and 10,000 rounds of ammunition for birds. The Australian government genuinely believed this would be sufficient. The logic, and I use that term loosely, went something like this. World War I had ended 14 years earlier. Soldier settlers, veterans who'd been given land grants to farm as a reward for military service, were trying to grow wheat in Western Australia. The Great Depression had crashed wheat prices, making farming barely profitable. And then 20,000 emus migrated into the farming area after their breeding season and started eating everything. Fact number 3. Emus can eat up to 1.5 pounds of vegetation per day, and they travel in mobs that can number in the hundreds. When 20,000 emus decide your wheat field looks delicious, they don't politely nibble around the edges. They demolish it. The farmers were already struggling with Depression-era economics, and now they had an invading army of 6-foot-tall birds eating their livelihoods. The farmers petitioned the government for help. They wanted the military to solve their emu problem, which seems excessive until you realize these were World War I veterans who'd seen what machine guns could do to massed infantry formations. From their perspective, emus moving in large groups across open ground were basically asking to be mowed down by automatic fire. It seemed like a solved problem. Fact number 4. The Australian Minister of Defence, Sir George Pearce, approved the military operation on the condition that the soldiers would be provided with free accommodation, food, and logistics by the farmers. The government would supply the weapons and ammunition. The farmers would supply everything else. This was the Depression after all. Budget consciousness applied even to wars against birds. On November 2nd, 1932, the military operation officially began. Major Meredith and his 2 soldiers, Sergeant McMurray and Gunner O'Halloran, arrived in Campion with their Lewis guns and high expectations. The plan was simple: locate the emu mobs, set up the machine guns, and open fire. The emus, being birds with brains the size of walnuts, would presumably stand there and get shot like the unintelligent animals they were. Fact number 5. Emus are not unintelligent animals. They're extremely difficult to hunt. They can run at speeds up to 30 miles per hour. They can sprint in zigzag patterns that make them nearly impossible to hit. And they have this extremely irritating habit of scattering in multiple directions when threatened. Trying to shoot emus with machine guns turned out to be like trying to shoot at a target that's simultaneously running away, changing direction, and splitting into smaller targets. The first engagement happened on November 2nd near the town of Campion. Meredith and his men located a mob of about 50 emus. They set up their Lewis guns, waited for the birds to come into range, and opened fire. The emus immediately scattered in every direction at full speed. The official report stated that only a few birds were killed in this first encounter. Fact number 6. The Lewis gun, the weapon chosen for this operation, was designed to fire at massed formations of slowly advancing infantry during World War I. It was perfect for targets that moved predictably in straight lines toward your position. Emus do not move predictably in straight lines toward your position. They move like caffeinated chaos in every direction except toward your position. The next few days went similarly poorly. The soldiers would locate an emu mob, set up their machine guns, open fire, and watch the birds scatter before they could inflict significant casualties. The emus learned quickly that the sound of gunfire meant run away immediately. They developed, and this is not an exaggeration, tactical awareness. They posted lookouts. The larger mobs would have emus at the perimeter who would watch for humans and sound an alarm, giving the rest of the mob time to scatter before the shooting started. Fact number 7. After just 6 days of operations, the soldiers had fired approximately 2,500 rounds of ammunition and killed fewer than 200 emus. The official ratio was roughly 10 rounds of ammunition per confirmed emu kill. For context, a competent infantry soldier in World War I was expected to achieve 1 hit for every 3 to 5 rounds fired. The Australian military was achieving 1 emu kill for every 10 rounds, and emus don't shoot back. The media started paying attention, which is when things got really embarrassing for the military. Australian newspapers ran stories with headlines mocking the operation. The Melbourne Herald called it a war against emus. The Australian public, already cynical about government spending during the Depression, started asking why exactly the military was wasting ammunition on birds when humans were struggling to find work and food. Fact number 8. On November 8th, just 6 days into the operation, the Australian military withdrew. Major Meredith pulled his soldiers and machine guns out of the field. The official reason given was that the operation was not achieving satisfactory results. The unofficial reason was that it had become a national embarrassment and continuing would just make it worse. But here's where it gets weirder. The emus didn't stop being a problem just because the military gave up. The farmers still had crops being destroyed. The emus were still there, still eating, still causing massive economic damage. The withdrawal didn't solve anything. It just meant the government had tried violence and failed, which is not a great look for a government or a military. The farmers kept complaining, politicians kept getting pressure from their constituents. And in late November, someone in the government decided that maybe they just hadn't tried hard enough the first time. Maybe the problem was tactical execution rather than fundamental strategic impossibility. Fact number 9. On November 12, 1932, just 4 days after withdrawing, the Australian military resumed operations against the emus. Major Meredith returned to Western Australia with his machine guns, apparently having convinced someone in the Defence Ministry that he'd learned from his mistakes and could do better this second time. The second campaign lasted until December 10th, nearly a month of renewed operations. The soldiers changed tactics. Instead of trying to ambush large mobs in open ground, they focused on smaller groups, used vehicles to chase emus into position, and tried to minimize the warning time birds had before shooting started. Fact number 10. Fact. The results barely improved. Over the course of the entire November-December campaign, the military fired approximately 9,860 rounds of ammunition and killed roughly 986 emus. The final ratio was about 10 rounds per emu, exactly the same as the first campaign. All the tactical adjustments, all the lessons learned, all the renewed effort resulted in the exact same dismal efficiency rate. Major Meredith filed his official report to the Australian Parliament in December 1932. The report is a masterpiece of trying to find positive spin for an objective disaster. Meredith noted that the emus had proven to be highly mobile and difficult to kill. He observed that their ability to scatter rapidly made concentrated fire ineffective. He mentioned that the birds seemed to develop tactical awareness after the first few encounters. Fact number 11. In his official report, Major Meredith wrote that the emu command structure was apparently better organized than the military's. The emus, quote, have apparently developed tactics, and when a number of birds are being chased, they will split up into smaller groups and go off in different directions. And even when an experienced soldier fires at them, the scatter tactics make it very difficult to kill more than a few birds. An Australian Army officer admitted in writing that birds had outmaneuvered him. The media had an absolute field day with this. Australian newspapers published editorials and political cartoons mocking the military failure. One cartoon showed emus wearing military medals. Another showed Australian soldiers surrendering to emus. The Sydney Morning Herald published a satirical piece suggesting that the emus should be awarded medals for their victory against the Australian military. Fact number 12. Dominic Saventi, an ornithologist who witnessed some of the emu operations, later wrote that the emus had developed guerrilla warfare tactics. They learned to avoid areas where shooting had occurred recently. They adjusted their grazing patterns to minimize exposure to human positions. They became, in Saventi's professional opinion, militarily intelligent opponents. Let's take a step back and talk about why this situation existed in the first place, because the context makes the whole thing even more absurd. Australia has a long, complicated history with introduced species and wildlife management disasters. The emu situation wasn't some bizarre anomaly. It was the latest in a series of ecological management failures. Fact number 13. Emus are native to Australia and have been part of the ecosystem for millions of years. Humans started farming in areas that were traditional emu migration routes and breeding grounds, then acted surprised when emus continued using those routes. The invasion was really just emus doing what emus had always done, except now there were wheat fields in the way. The soldier-settler farming program was well-intentioned, but poorly planned. The Australian government had promised land to World War I veterans as a reward for their service. These veterans had military training, combat experience, and absolutely no agricultural expertise. They were given land in Western Australia and told to figure out farming. Fact number 14. Most of the soldier-settler farms were marginal land that experienced farmers wouldn't have touched. The soil was poor, rainfall was inconsistent, and the area was prone to droughts. These weren't prime agricultural territories. They were basically the land equivalent of participation trophies. The government was giving veterans something, but not necessarily something useful. Then the Great Depression hit and wheat prices collapsed. Farmers who might have been able to scrape by during good economic times were now losing money on every harvest. Many were on the verge of bankruptcy. They couldn't afford to abandon their farms because they'd invested everything. They couldn't afford to keep farming because wheat wasn't profitable. They were trapped. Fact number 15. The emu migration happened every year after breeding season, which occurred around November and December. This wasn't new. Emus had been migrating through this region for thousands of years. But in 1932, the convergence of economic desperation, failed harvests, and massive emu populations created a crisis that felt like it needed immediate government intervention. The farmers, being former soldiers, understood military solutions. They'd seen machine guns clear German trenches. They'd seen artillery destroy fortified positions. They genuinely believed that applying military force to emus would solve the problem quickly and efficiently. From their perspective, it wasn't a crazy idea. It was just using proven tactics against a new enemy. Fact number 16. The Australian government was also politically motivated to do something visible. These were voter constituents, many of them veterans, demanding help. Refusing would look callous, especially during the Depression when the government was already being criticised for not doing enough to help struggling citizens. A military operation looked decisive, strong, and relatively cheap. The ammunition expenditure became a political problem when newspapers started calculating the costs. 10,000 rounds of ammunition at Depression-era prices wasn't a trivial expense when the government was cutting other programs. Members of Parliament started asking whether machine gunning emus was really the best use of limited resources. Fact number 17. After the operation ended in December 1932, the Australian Parliament held debates about the emu operation's costs and effectiveness. Opposition members criticised the government for wasting ammunition. Government members defended the operation as assisting struggling farmers. The debates were recorded in Hansard, the official parliamentary record, which means Australia's military defeat to emus is permanently documented in government archives. A member of the Australian House of Representatives, after reviewing the operation's results, suggested that a medal should be struck for soldiers who'd served in the Emu War. Another MP suggested that the emus should be given machine guns since they had proven more tactically competent than the soldiers. Australian parliamentary debates are normally dignified affairs. The emu discussions were delightfully petty. Fact number 18. The government's official position after the operation ended was that military intervention was not a suitable solution for wildlife management. They recommended that farmers use conventional hunting methods, bounties, and fencing instead. This was sensible advice that completely ignored the fact that farmers had been requesting exactly this kind of help because conventional methods weren't working. The bounty system that replaced military operations paid farmers a small amount for every emu killed. Over the following years, this system resulted in the deaths of tens of thousands of emus. It was slower than a military operation, more distributed across many individual hunters, and ultimately more effective at reducing emu populations. Fact number 19. Between 1934 and 1950, the Western Australian government paid bounties on over 57,000 emus. The bounty system killed more emus in a few years than military operations could have killed in decades. The lesson, apparently, was that economic incentives work better than machine guns, which seems like something that shouldn't require an actual war to figure out. The military operations had one unintended positive effect. The publicity generated by the Emu War brought national attention to the plight of Western Australian farmers. The government allocated more resources for agricultural support, better fencing programs, and irrigation projects. Losing to emus was embarrassing, but it did result in actual help for the farmers. Fact number 20. The Great Emu War became a cultural touchstone in Australian history. It's referenced in popular culture, taught in schools as an example of government overreach and unintended consequences, and used internationally as a punchline about Australia's unique wildlife challenges. The Australian War Memorial in Canberra doesn't have an exhibit about the Emu War, but they get asked about it constantly. Major Meredith apparently never spoke publicly about the operation after filing his official report. He went on to have a perfectly respectable military career, serving in World War II, and eventually retiring with honours. But the Emu War remained the thing he was most famous for, which must have been frustrating for a man who'd actually served in 2 real wars against human opponents. Fact number 21. The Lewis guns used in the operation still exist. At least one of the machine guns used against emus is preserved in an Australian military museum. It's a functioning firearm with historical significance, though that significance is mostly comedic. Not many weapons can claim to have lost a war to birds. The 2 soldiers who served with Meredith, Sergeant McMurray and Gunner O'Halloran, returned to regular military service. There's no record of either man discussing the emu operations publicly. One imagines they were perfectly happy to let that particular military adventure fade into obscurity, though their service records permanently note their participation in the 1932 Western Australia operations. Fact number 22. Emus are still a problem for Australian farmers in some regions. The population is stable, estimated at between 600,000 and 725,000 birds across Australia. They still damage crops, farmers still request government assistance, but nobody has suggested deploying the military since 1932, which shows that at least one lesson was learned. The speed at which emus can run, 30 miles per hour, is faster than most humans can sprint and comparable to many vehicles on rough terrain. The soldiers in 1932 tried pursuing emus in trucks and found that the birds could outmaneuver vehicles by cutting through brush and rough ground that trucks couldn't navigate. 4-wheel drive vehicles weren't common in 1932, which gave emus a significant mobility advantage. Fact number 23. An emu's height, typically 5 to 6 feet tall, makes them difficult to kill quickly even with machine gun fire. The vital areas, the head and heart, are small targets on a moving bird. Body shots would wound emus but not drop them immediately, allowing wounded birds to escape and die later where their deaths couldn't be confirmed. This inflated the ammunition to kill ratio. The emus' physical resilience surprised the soldiers. Birds that took multiple hits sometimes kept running. The soldiers had expected that machine gun fire would simply shred the emus, like it had shredded human infantry in World War I. Instead, they discovered that emus are tough, durable animals with strong leg muscles and a body structure that can absorb damage and keep moving. Fact number 24. Emus have exceptional eyesight and can detect movement at great distances. They can see predators approaching from over a kilometer away in open terrain. This meant the soldiers could never achieve complete surprise. The emus would spot approaching trucks or soldiers setting up positions and begin moving away before the shooting started. The November-December timing of the operation was actually the worst possible time to hunt emus. This was after breeding season, when emus are most dispersed across the landscape rather than concentrated in breeding areas. The soldiers were trying to engage scattered mobile targets rather than concentrated stationary ones. Better planning would have targeted emus during breeding season when they're less mobile. Fact number 25. The sound of a Lewis gun firing, a distinctive rapid chattering noise, became associated with danger in the emu population. After the first few days of operations, emus within earshot of gunfire would immediately flee at the sound, even before seeing the soldiers. The birds had learned acoustic threat recognition, demonstrating intelligence that surprised the military. The media coverage of the Emu War wasn't limited to Australia. International newspapers picked up the story. The British press found it hilarious that the Australian military, part of the British Empire's defence structure, had been defeated by flightless birds. American newspapers ran it as a humorous human interest story. The operation became an international embarrassment. Fact number 26. One British newspaper published a satirical piece suggesting that Australia should formally negotiate a peace treaty with the emus. Another suggested that Australia's military budget should be reduced since they apparently couldn't defeat birds. The mockery was gentle but persistent, and it contributed to the Australian government's decision not to authorise any further military operations against wildlife. The political fallout from the Emu War influenced Australian wildlife management policy for decades. The government established clearer boundaries between military operations, which were for defence against human threats, and pest control operations, which were the responsibility of agricultural and wildlife management departments. This separation prevented future situations where the military might be deployed against animal populations. Fact number 27. The Department of Agriculture took over EMU management after the military withdrawal. They recommended bounties, fencing, and shooting by civilian hunters rather than military operations. This proved more effective and less politically embarrassing. Civilian hunters familiar with the terrain and emu behavior had better success than soldiers trained for conventional warfare. The fencing programs initiated after the Emu War had mixed results. The rabbit-proof fence, built to control rabbit populations, was sometimes used to divert emu migrations. But emus can jump fences up to 7 feet high if they're motivated, and they can run along fence lines until they find a gap or weak point. Fencing slowed emus down, but didn't stop them. Fact number 28. Modern emu management in Australia uses a combination of methods including exclusion fencing, population monitoring, selective culling, and habitat modification. None of these methods involves the military. The lesson from 1932, that military force is ineffective against highly mobile wildlife, has been thoroughly learned and remembered. The Emu War also influenced how Australia approached other wildlife conflicts. When kangaroo populations became problematic in certain areas, the response was controlled hunting and population management, not military deployment. When dingoes threatened livestock, the solution was the dingo fence, not artillery. The military stayed in their lane after 1932. Fact number 29. Australia is one of the few countries in the world to have officially deployed military forces against an animal population and lost. There are historical examples of pest control operations using military personnel, but most of those were successful or at least achieved a draw. Australia's clear defeat to emus is historically unique. The Lewis gun's rate of fire, 500 rounds per minute, should theoretically have been devastating to emu populations. In practice, the guns overheated quickly when fired continuously, jammed in dusty conditions, and proved difficult to aim at fast-moving targets. The weapon that had been so effective in static trench warfare was poorly suited to mobile wildlife hunting. Fact number 30. The soldiers tried various tactics during the operation. They attempted night raids, which failed because emus have excellent hearing and fled before soldiers got close. They tried using vehicles for high-speed pursuits, which failed because emus could maneuver through terrain vehicles couldn't navigate. They tried patience and ambush tactics, which failed because emus learned to avoid areas where ambushes had occurred previously. One proposed tactic that was never implemented involved mounting machine guns on trucks to create mobile firing platforms. The idea was that soldiers could drive alongside running emus and shoot from moving vehicles. This was rejected as impractical and dangerous, which shows that even in the midst of absurd operations, someone had enough sense to draw a line at certain levels of ridiculous. The weather conditions during the operation were brutal for the soldiers, but perfect for the emus. November and December in Western Australia meant temperatures regularly exceeding 100 degrees Fahrenheit. The soldiers were wearing wool uniforms designed for European climates, carrying heavy weapons and equipment, and chasing animals that were biologically adapted to handle extreme heat without breaking stride. Fact number 31. Emus have specialized respiratory systems that allow them to cool themselves efficiently even in desert conditions. They can lower their metabolic heat production and increase evaporative cooling through panting. Humans in wool uniforms carrying machine guns cannot do this. The thermal advantage went entirely to the birds. The soldiers' daily routine during the operation involved waking before dawn to locate emu mobs, while the birds were still relatively stationary at roosting sites. By the time the soldiers set up their weapons and prepared to fire, the sun would be rising and temperatures climbing. The emus would scatter at the first sound of engines or footsteps. The soldiers would spend the rest of the day tracking scattered birds in increasing heat, achieving minimal results, and returning to base exhausted and frustrated. Fact number 32. The physical conditioning required to hunt emus on foot in Australian summer heat exceeded what most soldiers possessed. These were men trained for trench warfare, which involved periods of intense activity, followed by long waits in static positions. Emu hunting required sustained cardiovascular effort over hours in extreme conditions. The emus were basically running ultramarathons, while the soldiers were trying to keep up in combat boots. The communication technology available in 1932 was primitive by modern standards. The soldiers had no radios for coordinating movements. They couldn't call for support or share information about emu locations in real time. Each hunting party operated independently, which meant they couldn't execute coordinated drives or ambushes that might have been more effective. Fact number 33. If the soldiers had possessed modern communication equipment like two-way radios or even simple walkie-talkies, they might have been able to coordinate multi-directional approaches that prevented emus from escaping. But 1932 military communications meant runners, written messages, and pre-arranged meeting points. The emus moved faster than messages could travel. The psychological warfare aspect of facing an enemy that doesn't understand the concept of warfare created unique frustrations. Human enemies can be intimidated, demoralized, or convinced to surrender. Emus experienced none of these psychological states. They felt hunger, fear, and the urge to flee danger. Attempts to break their morale were meaningless because morale is a human concept. Fact number 34. Military strategists talk about winning hearts and minds, breaking enemy will, and achieving psychological dominance. None of these concepts apply when your opponent is a bird with a brain the size of a walnut. The entire psychological dimension of warfare simply didn't exist. The emus weren't brave or cowardly. They were just emus responding to stimuli according to millions of years of evolutionary programming. The ammunition used in the operation, 303 British rounds, cost money that Depression-era Australia could barely afford to spend. Each round represented resources that could have been used for unemployment relief, infrastructure projects, or agricultural subsidies. The political opposition used these cost figures to attack the government's priorities and competence. Fact number 35. The exact cost of the ammunition expended during the Emu War was documented in parliamentary records. Opposition members calculated the cost per emu killed and compared it unfavorably to the cost of simply compensating farmers for crop losses. The math was brutal. The government had spent more money failing to kill emus than it would have cost to just buy the destroyed wheat from farmers. The concept of victory conditions was never clearly defined before the operation began. What would constitute success? Killing all 20,000 emus, reducing the population by 50%, driving the emus away from farmland? Without clear objectives, the operation had no way to measure progress or determine when it had achieved enough to stop. Fact number 36. Modern military doctrine emphasizes clear mission objectives with measurable outcomes. The Emu War had vague goals like reduce emu populations or protect crops. These objectives were imprecise enough that success or failure became subjective. Military operations need concrete success criteria. Kill this many enemies, capture this territory, destroy these assets. The Emu War had none of this clarity. The ammunition used during the operation represented a significant expense that Depression-era Australia could barely afford. Each bullet cost money that could have been spent on unemployment relief or agricultural support. The political opposition calculated the cost per emu killed and used these figures to attack the government's competence and priorities in parliamentary debates. The press coverage of the Emu War evolved from neutral reporting to open mockery within days of the operation's start. Early newspaper articles described the deployment in straightforward military terms. Within a week, journalists were writing satirical pieces about soldiers struggling against birds. By the operation's end, Australian newspapers were running political cartoons and comedy sketches at the government's expense. Fact number 37. Australian newspaper cartoons from late November 1932 depicted emus wearing military medals and uniforms. One cartoon showed an emu general accepting the surrender of Australian soldiers. Another illustrated emus holding a victory parade through Sydney. The media had recognised the comedic potential immediately and exploited it ruthlessly. Government officials stopped giving interviews because every statement generated more mockery. The farmers caught in the middle of this publicity disaster had complicated feelings about the whole situation. They'd requested help with a genuine agricultural crisis and received international embarrassment instead. Their legitimate problems were now associated with a military farce that would be remembered for decades. Some farmers defended the soldiers and blamed poor government planning. Others regretted requesting military intervention in the first place. Fact number 38. Interviews with Western Australian farmers conducted in the 1970s and 1980s reveal that many felt the publicity damaged their communities more than it helped. They'd needed effective quiet assistance. They received loud, ineffective spectacle. The association between their region and the military failure persisted long after the emu problems were actually resolved through conventional methods. The international media picked up the story quickly. British newspapers found it hilarious that Australian military forces, part of the British Empire's defence structure, had been defeated by flightless birds. American papers ran it as an amusing curiosity story. The operation became an international embarrassment that damaged Australia's reputation as a modern, developed nation. Fact number 39. The London Times published a satirical editorial suggesting that if Australia couldn't defeat emus, perhaps they needed British military advisors to teach proper tactics. The New York Times ran a humorous piece comparing the Emu War to historical military disasters, placing it alongside far more serious defeats as an example of overconfident planning meeting harsh reality. The long-term impact on Australian civil-military relations was subtle but significant. The Emu War established an informal precedent that military forces shouldn't be deployed for wildlife management or agricultural pest control. This boundary between military and civilian problems hadn't been clearly defined before 1932. The spectacular failure created clarity through negative example. Fact number 40. After 1932, any proposal to use Australian military forces for non-defence purposes faced immediate scepticism. The Emu War became governmental shorthand for misapplied resources and inappropriate use of military assets. When officials suggested deploying soldiers for civilian problems, someone would mention the emus, and the discussion would shift toward whether the military was actually the right tool for the job. The ecological understanding of emu populations improved dramatically after the publicity from the war. Scientists became interested in studying why the birds had proven so difficult to kill. Ornithologists researched emu behavior, migration patterns, and population dynamics. This scientific attention eventually led to better wildlife management strategies that didn't involve machine guns. Fact number 41. Dominic Saventi, the ornithologist who observed parts of the Emu War, published several research papers based on his field observations during the military operations. His work documented emu social structures, anti-predator behaviors, and habitat preferences. The military failure became valuable scientific data that contributed to understanding Australian wildlife ecology. The bounty system that replaced military operations proved far more effective at reducing emu populations. Between 1934 and 1950, the Western Australian government paid bounties on over 57,000 emus. Individual hunters familiar with the terrain and emu behavior achieved better results than soldiers with machine guns. Local knowledge defeated military training in this particular conflict. Fact number 42. The bounty payment per emu was small, usually just a few shillings per bird, but thousands of hunters participating over years killed more emus than any military operation could have. The distributed approach worked better than concentrated force. The lesson was that persistent patient effort beats dramatic overwhelming force when dealing with highly mobile wildlife populations. The fencing programs initiated after the Emu War had mixed success. The rabbit-proof fence, originally built to control rabbit populations, was sometimes used to divert emu migrations. But emus can jump fences up to 7 feet high when motivated. They can also run along fence lines until they find gaps or weak points. Fencing slowed emus down, but never stopped them completely. Fact number 43. The total cost of wildlife fencing in Australia exceeds hundreds of millions of dollars when you account for the rabbit-proof fence, the dingo fence, and countless smaller barrier systems. These fences represent enormous investments in trying to control wildlife through physical exclusion. Some work better than others, but none have been perfect solutions. The dingo fence, built to protect sheep from dingo predation, stretches over 3,400 miles across southeastern Australia. It's one of the longest structures ever built by humans. Unlike the Emu War, the dingo fence actually works reasonably well at reducing dingo attacks on livestock. This proves that sometimes massive infrastructure projects are appropriate solutions, just not for emus. Fact number 44. The dingo fence costs millions of dollars annually to maintain. Teams of workers patrol the fence constantly, repairing damage from weather, animals, and erosion. Despite this expense, the fence remains cost-effective compared to livestock losses from dingo predation. The difference between the dingo fence and the Emu War is that the fence was designed for the specific problem it addresses. Australia's next major wildlife management disaster came just 3 years after the Emu War. In 1935, cane toads were introduced from South America to control beetle pests in Queensland sugarcane fields. The toads were supposed to eat the beetles that damaged crops. They didn't. Instead, cane toads became one of Australia's worst invasive species problems. Fact number 45. Cane toads don't actually eat the beetles they were imported to control. The beetles live in the upper parts of cane plants. Cane toads stay on the ground. Nobody apparently tested whether cane toads could actually reach the beetles before importing thousands of them and releasing them into Australian ecosystems. This represents a pattern of well-intentioned interventions creating worse problems than they solve. The cane toad population in Australia is now estimated at over 200 million individuals. They've spread from Queensland across northern Australia, poisoning native predators that try to eat them. Cane toads secrete toxins from glands on their skin. Native animals that evolve without exposure to these toxins have no defenses. Snakes, lizards, and small mammals die after attempting to eat cane toads. Fact number 46. The ecological damage from cane toads includes the decline of multiple native predator species. Northern quolls, a marsupial predator, have been devastated in areas where cane toads spread. Some snake populations have declined by over 90%. The cane toad introduction represents ecological damage that will persist for decades or centuries. The Emu War was embarrassing. The cane toad introduction was catastrophic. The pattern of introducing species to Australia for pest control or agriculture, only to have those species become worse problems, repeats throughout Australian history. Rabbits were introduced for hunting in 1859. By the 1920s, Australia had 10 billion rabbits destroying agriculture and native ecosystems. That's roughly 400 rabbits for every human in Australia at the time. Fact number 47. The rabbit plague in Australia caused more agricultural damage than emus ever did. Rabbits ate crops, destroyed pasture land, caused massive soil erosion, and outcompeted native animals for food and burrows. The economic impact ran into millions of pounds annually. The rabbit-proof fence, built between 1901 and 1907, failed to control rabbit spread because rabbits were already on both sides when construction finished. Foxes were introduced to Australia for fox hunting, a traditional British sport. The foxes promptly ignored the hunting tradition and started eating native Australian wildlife instead. Foxes have contributed to the extinction of multiple small native mammal species and continue threatening many others. Another introduced species that became a conservation disaster. Fact number 48. European cats brought to Australia as pets established feral populations that now number in the millions. Feral cats kill approximately 1 billion native animals per year in Australia. They're responsible for multiple extinctions and threaten dozens of endangered species. The Australian government's current cat control programs are more extensive and better planned than the Emu War, but they face similar challenges of controlling highly adaptable mobile populations across vast territories. The Australian War on Cats, announced in 2015, set a goal of culling 2 million feral cats by 2020 to protect native wildlife. This program uses professional hunters, strategic poisoning, and exclusion fencing rather than military deployment. The media inevitably compared it to the Emu War, but the cat program has been more successful, though also more controversial. Fact number 49. The cat culling program sparked international outrage from animal rights organisations. People who'd never heard of northern quolls or bilbies were suddenly very concerned about Australian feral cats. The government had to explain repeatedly that feral cats in Australia are ecological disasters, not cuddly pets. The public relations challenge demonstrated that wildlife management often involves difficult choices that upset people who don't understand the full context. The ecological cost of introduced species in Australia is estimated at billions of dollars annually. Native species continue going extinct due to introduced predators and competitors. Agricultural productivity suffers from invasive plants and animals. The cumulative damage from 2 centuries of introducing species without understanding consequences shapes modern Australian environmental policy. Fact number 50. Of the roughly 50 mammal species that have gone extinct globally in the past 200 years, approximately 30 were Australian species. Most of these extinctions resulted from introduced predators like cats and foxes, combined with habitat destruction. Australia's extinction rate is among the highest in the world. The pattern of human interference creating cascading ecological problems continues despite lessons supposedly learned from past failures. The Aboriginal Australians had managed the continent's ecosystems for over 40,000 years before European contact. They used controlled burns, selective hunting, and seasonal movement patterns to maintain landscapes that supported both human needs and wildlife populations. The Emu crisis of 1932 wouldn't have happened under traditional management because the land use patterns would have been completely different. Fact number 51. Aboriginal fire management created mosaic landscapes with different vegetation stages that supported diverse wildlife populations while reducing catastrophic wildfire risk. European settlers suppressed all fires, leading to fuel accumulation and eventually massive uncontrollable bushfires. Like the Emu War, this represented Europeans imposing their methods on an environment they fundamentally didn't understand. The ecological knowledge that could have prevented the Emu War existed in Aboriginal communities. Traditional owners understood emu migration patterns, breeding cycles, and habitat needs. This knowledge wasn't consulted because early 20th century Australian society didn't value Aboriginal environmental expertise. The institutional failure to access existing knowledge is a recurring pattern in environmental management disasters. Fact number 52. Modern Australian environmental management increasingly incorporates Aboriginal traditional knowledge alongside Western science. This integration happens slowly and imperfectly, but it represents recognition that Indigenous Australians possess deep understanding of ecosystems that European agricultural methods disrupted. If this knowledge had been respected in 1932, the emu situation might have been managed without military intervention. The Great Depression's impact on Australian agriculture created the economic desperation that led to the Emu War. Wheat prices had collapsed from approximately 6 shillings per bushel in the late 1920s to under 3 shillings by 1932. Farmers who'd taken debt to establish operations couldn't repay loans. Banks foreclosed on properties. Rural poverty reached crisis levels. Fact number 53. The soldier-settler program that placed World War I veterans on Western Australian farmland was well-intentioned but poorly planned. The land was marginal, suitable for grazing, but challenging for wheat farming. The settlers had military training but minimal agricultural expertise. The government provided land grants but insufficient support for actually making the farms productive. The program set people up for failure, and the emu problem was just one symptom of larger structural issues. The political calculations behind authorizing the Emu War make more sense when viewed through the lens of Depression-era politics. Defense Minister George Pearce needed to demonstrate government action to support struggling rural voters during an election year. Deploying the military looked decisive and strong. The operation was relatively cheap by military budget standards. If it worked, it would solve a real problem while generating positive publicity. Fact number 54. George Pearce served as Defense Minister from 1932 to 1934, spanning the Emu War period. He faced parliamentary criticism for the operation's failure, but defended it as a good faith attempt to assist farmers. He wasn't reappointed as Defense Minister after 1934, though this was likely due to broader political changes rather than emu-related failures specifically. His political career continued in other portfolios. The 2 soldiers who served under Major Meredith, Sergeant McMurray, and Gunner O'Halloran were following orders from superior officers throughout the operation. They didn't plan the strategy, didn't choose the tactics, and weren't responsible for the fundamental conceptual failures. They showed up, did what they were told, and watched emus outmaneuver them repeatedly despite their best efforts. Fact number 55. There's no historical record of either soldier requesting removal from emu duty, even though the operation was clearly failing and becoming a national joke. This suggests either remarkable dedication to duty or pragmatic recognition that complaining wouldn't help their situations. Either way, they stuck it out until officially withdrawn, maintaining professional military discipline throughout an absurd assignment. The Lewis gun's mechanical reliability in dusty Australian conditions was problematic. The weapon was designed for European warfare, where mud was the primary environmental challenge. In Western Australia's dry, dusty environment, the guns jammed more frequently. Soldiers spent significant time cleaning and maintaining weapons between hunting attempts. Fact number 56. The maintenance requirements for Lewis guns in desert conditions included frequent disassembly and cleaning to prevent dust accumulation in the firing mechanism. This maintenance work consumed hours that could have been spent actually hunting. The soldiers were splitting their time between serving as armorers and ineffective emu hunters. The weapons that worked brilliantly in Belgian trenches struggled in Australian outback conditions. The 10,000 rounds of ammunition initially allocated for the operation sounds enormous for hunting purposes. It is, but military planners were thinking in terms of sustained combat operations, where thousands of rounds might be fired in single engagements. From a World War I combat perspective, 10,000 rounds was actually a conservative estimate for extended operations. Fact number 57. During World War I, single days of artillery barrage could involve firing hundreds of thousands of shells. Infantry units sometimes expended tens of thousands of rifle and machine gun rounds during major offensives. The military's ammunition allocation for the Emu War reflected combat thinking rather than hunting thinking. This mental framework was part of why the operation failed. They were planning for war when they needed to plan for pest control. The aftermath of the Emu War included quiet internal military reviews examining what went wrong. These reviews weren't published or publicly discussed, but they apparently led to clearer guidelines about when military forces should and shouldn't be deployed for non-military purposes. The lessons were learned internally, even if not acknowledged publicly. Fact number 58. The Australian Defence Force today maintains strict protocols about deployment for non-defence purposes. Military units can be called for disaster relief, emergency response, and specific national security situations. Wildlife management is explicitly excluded from the list of appropriate military missions. This restriction is almost certainly a direct legacy of the 1932 AMU experience, though official documentation doesn't explicitly draw that connection. The media's role in publicizing the Emu War failure was crucial for governmental accountability. Without newspaper coverage, the operation might have been a quiet embarrassment, known only to participants and officials directly involved. The media transformed it into a national story that forced public accountability and prevented future similar operations through creating political consequences for failure. Fact number 59. Australian newspapers in the 1930s were partisan and often aggressively critical of government actions. The Emu War gave opposition papers ammunition, both literal and figurative, to mock the government's competence. The coverage influenced public opinion and created political pressure that contributed to ending the operation and preventing repeat attempts. Free press serving as check on governmental power, demonstrated through mockery of military operations against birds. The soldiers' field reports to Major Meredith documented their tactical observations and attempts to adapt to emu behavior. These reports were taken seriously initially. Meredith genuinely tried to modify tactics based on what his men were learning. They experimented with different approaches, different times of day, different weapon placements. Everything failed, but the failure wasn't from lack of tactical flexibility or inability to learn. Fact number 60. Military doctrine emphasizes learning from battlefield experience and adapting tactics accordingly. The Emu War soldiers did exactly this. They observed emu responses to ambushes and changed their approach. They noted that emus posted sentries and adjusted their tactics to account for this behavior. The problem wasn't that soldiers couldn't learn or adapt. The problem was that no amount of tactical adaptation could overcome the fundamental mismatch between military methods designed for conventional warfare and the reality of hunting highly mobile dispersed wildlife. The concept of declaring war on animal species has ancient historical precedents. Humans have historically treated pest animals as enemies to be eliminated, rather than ecological components to be managed. The Emu War was unusual only in its explicit military framing and spectacular failure, not in the underlying human impulse to apply violent solutions to wildlife conflicts. Fact number 61. Medieval European kingdoms occasionally put animals on trial for crimes. Rats were tried for destroying crops. Pigs were tried for killing children. These trials followed legal procedures, appointed defense attorneys for the animals, and sometimes resulted in formal executions. Humans have a persistent tendency to treat animal problems as legal, military, or moral issues rather than ecological ones requiring scientific management. The comparison between the 1932 Emu War and China's 1958 Four Pests campaign reveals interesting parallels. China mobilized millions of citizens to eliminate sparrows, believing the birds ate too much grain. They killed approximately 1 billion sparrows before realizing this caused an insect population explosion that destroyed crops worse than sparrows ever had. Both campaigns demonstrate the dangers of oversimplified ecological thinking. Fact number 62. The four-pest campaign killed sparrows through exhaustion. Citizens banged pots and drums to prevent sparrows from landing. The birds flew until they died from fatigue. This method was labor-intensive, but effective at killing sparrows. It was also catastrophically stupid from an ecological perspective. Sparrows eat insects as well as grain. Eliminating sparrows meant locust populations exploded, causing famines that contributed to deaths of millions of people. The Emu War failed to kill enough emus to matter. The Four Pests campaign succeeded in killing sparrows and thereby helped cause one of history's worst famines. The United States military has conducted operations against wildlife, though these are rarely called wars. In the 1920s, Army units were deployed to assist with wolf eradication programs in western states. These operations were generally more successful than the Emu War because wolves are easier to track, trap and kill than emus, and because the programs used appropriate methods including poison and traps rather than just machine guns. Fact number 63. The US military wolf eradication operations benefited from Native American scouts who understood wolf behavior and tracking. The programs also sustained hunting pressure over years rather than brief intensive campaigns. The difference in outcomes reflects better planning and appropriate methodology rather than superior military competence. When you use the right tools for the job, you get better results. India experiences human-wildlife conflicts that make the Emu War look trivial by comparison. Elephant-human conflicts kill hundreds of people annually in India. Crop damage from wildlife costs Indian farmers billions of rupees. The Indian government has never deployed military forces against elephants, possibly because they learned from other nations' failures, or possibly because shooting elephants with machine guns would create even worse publicity than shooting emus. Fact number 64. The Indian government's approach to elephant conflicts includes creating wildlife corridors, compensating farmers for crop damage, and using non-lethal deterrents like chili smoke bombs and electric fencing. These methods are expensive and imperfect, but they actually address the problem without creating international embarrassment or ecological catastrophe. The contrast with the Emu War demonstrates that effective wildlife management requires understanding animal behavior and ecology, not just applying force. Africa's long history of human-wildlife conflict includes situations where military or paramilitary forces became involved. However, these operations typically protect wildlife from poachers rather than eliminating wildlife. Anti-poaching units in many African countries are paramilitary organizations with military training and equipment. They're generally effective because they're fighting organized human criminals using military tactics, not trying to apply military methods to wildlife management. Fact number 65. The difference between anti-poaching operations and the Emu War is fundamental. Anti-poaching targets human criminals who understand concepts like deterrence, arrest, and consequences. Military methods work against humans because humans respond to military logic. Birds don't understand deterrence. They understand immediate threats and respond with instinctive flight behaviors. You can't intimidate an emu into surrendering. The environmental movement's growth in decades after the Emu War gradually changed public attitudes toward wildlife. Animals shifted from being pests to be eliminated to being components of ecosystems requiring management. Emus went from agricultural enemies to protected native species. This cultural transformation probably prevented more attempts at military wildlife management than any lessons officially learned from the 1932 failure. Fact number 66. The Australian Conservation Foundation, founded in 1965, advocates for science-based wildlife management and ecosystem protection. Organizations like this provide institutional support for environmental rather than military approaches to human-wildlife conflicts. Their existence and political influence make it difficult to authorize shooting campaigns against native species, which is probably for the best given historical track records. The technological advances since 1932 mean that modern military operations against wildlife would be even more absurd than the original Emu War. Imagine deploying drones, guided missiles, or attack helicopters against emus. The disproportion between technological capability and target significance would be comedy on an unprecedented scale. Fortunately, nobody seems tempted to try, though the hypothetical is entertaining. Fact number 67. The Australian Defence Force now operates sophisticated surveillance systems, advanced weaponry, and coordinated multi-platform capabilities that would make 1932 military technology look primitive. Deploying any of this against emus would cost millions of dollars per bird killed. The economic absurdity alone prevents consideration of military wildlife operations. Progress sometimes comes from recognizing that your expensive tools are completely wrong for certain jobs. The cultural legacy of the Emu War extends far beyond Australia. It's become international shorthand for governmental overreach, misapplied military force, and the dangers of overconfidence when dealing with complex systems. When modern governments propose using disproportionate force against minor problems, someone inevitably mentions the Emu War as a cautionary example. Fact number 68. The Emu War appears in military history courses at defense academies internationally. It's taught alongside genuinely important military operations as a case study in mission planning failures, unclear objectives, and inadequate intelligence gathering. Australian military officers learn about their predecessors losing to birds as part of professional development, which must create interesting moments in international military education settings. The economic analysis of the Emu War remains instructive for understanding governmental decision-making under pressure. The operation cost approximately 4 times more than the crop damage it was meant to prevent. Even if it had succeeded completely, it would have been economically irrational. The fact that it failed makes the economics even worse. Sometimes the most expensive option is also the least effective. Fact number 69. Modern cost-benefit analysis would have prevented the Emu War before it started. But cost-benefit analysis, as a standard governmental practice, wasn't well established in 1932. Decision-makers focused on political optics and immediate action rather than systematic evaluation of alternatives. The legacy includes better frameworks for evaluating policy options before implementation, though governments still sometimes ignore their own analysis for political reasons. The comparison between the Emu War and modern asymmetric warfare occasionally appears in military strategic analysis. Both involve technologically superior forces struggling against mobile opponents who use terrain and mobility to their advantage. The specific tactics differ dramatically, but the fundamental problem remains consistent. Military superiority doesn't guarantee victory when the enemy won't engage conventionally and can disperse rapidly when threatened. Fact number 70. The lessons from the Emu War about asymmetric conflict aren't directly applicable to human warfare because emus lack human intelligence, organization, and weapons. But the broader principle holds. Overwhelming firepower becomes irrelevant if you can't bring it to bear on targets effectively. The emus won not through superior tactics, but through biology and behavior that made them unsuitable targets for military weapons designed for completely different purposes. The preservation of detailed records from the Emu War creates opportunities for historical analysis. Major Meredith's reports, parliamentary debates, newspaper coverage, and government correspondence provide comprehensive documentation. Future researchers can study not just what happened, but why decisions were made and how public opinion evolved. Australian government archives maintain these records, ensuring the story survives and continues teaching cautionary lessons about overconfidence and inappropriate application of military force. The final lesson of the Emu War might be about humility. Humans, even well-trained humans with superior technology, can be defeated by animals when environmental conditions and circumstances favor the animals. This doesn't make humans weak or incompetent. It makes nature formidable and complex. The soldiers who fought in the Emu War weren't failures. They were people given an impossible task and blamed when they couldn't achieve the impossible. Fact number 71. The soldiers deployed in the Emu War had survived World War I, one of history's deadliest conflicts. They'd faced machine gun fire, artillery barrages, poison gas, and trench warfare. Their combat credentials were legitimate. Their defeat by emus wasn't due to cowardice or incompetence, but to being assigned a mission that military methods couldn't solve. Sometimes bravery and training aren't enough when the fundamental approach is wrong. The psychological impact on soldiers who participated in the Emu War is undocumented, but probably significant. Imagine surviving years of brutal trench warfare, returning home as a decorated veteran, and then being defeated by flightless birds. That experience would challenge anyone's sense of professional competence and military identity. The cognitive dissonance must have been profound. Fact number 72. Combat veterans from World War I had witnessed mechanized slaughter on unprecedented scales. They'd seen machine guns mow down advancing infantry by the thousands. The fact that these same weapons proved ineffective against emus represented a fundamental disconnect between what they knew about warfare and what actually happened in Western Australia. The weapons that killed humans efficiently couldn't kill birds efficiently, which undermines assumptions about technology and power. The media coverage of the Emu War created a narrative template that gets applied to similar governmental failures decades later. When governments deploy inappropriate resources to solve problems, journalists and critics reference the Emu War. The story has become a cultural shorthand that transcends its specific historical context. Fact number 73. Modern political satirists and comedians regularly reference the Emu War when mocking governmental incompetence. The phrase, like Australia's war on emus, appears in political commentary internationally whenever governments propose using dramatic force against minor problems. The Emu War achieved immortality as the perfect metaphor for overconfident planning meeting embarrassing reality. Australia's relationship with its unique wildlife continues creating bizarre situations that echo the Emu War's absurdity. The country has ongoing conflicts with kangaroos, cassowaries, crocodiles, and various other animals that don't exist anywhere else on Earth. Each conflict reveals similar tensions between human activity and wildlife behavior that Europeans still don't fully understand, despite centuries of colonization. Fact number 74. Kangaroo populations in some Australian regions have grown large enough to damage agricultural areas and create traffic hazards. The government authorises controlled culling through licensed hunters rather than military operations. The kangaroo management programs are controversial, but avoid the spectacular failure mode of deploying soldiers with machine guns. Learning from the Emu War apparently means never again using the military for wildlife management, regardless of how tempting it might seem politically. The cassowary, a large flightless bird related to emus, occasionally attacks humans in northeastern Australia. Cassowaries are more dangerous than emus, equipped with powerful legs and dagger-like claws that can disembowel people. Despite being genuinely threatening animals, nobody has suggested deploying military forces against cassowaries. The Emu War's legacy includes establishing clear boundaries about appropriate responses to wildlife conflicts. Fact number 75. Cassowaries kill approximately 1 to 2 people per year in Australia, usually when humans get too close while the birds are protecting nests or chicks. These deaths are tragic, but don't trigger calls for cassowary eradication campaigns. Modern wildlife management recognizes that humans entering cassowary territory bear responsibility for avoiding dangerous wildlife. This represents sophisticated understanding that was absent in 1932, when emus eating crops justified military intervention. Australia's spider and snake populations create different kinds of human-wildlife conflicts. The country has multiple species of highly venomous spiders and snakes that regularly enter human habitations. Public health responses involve education about identification and first aid rather than extermination campaigns. The shift toward coexistence rather than elimination reflects lessons learned from failed eradication attempts. Fact number 76. The Sydney funnel web spider is one of the world's most dangerous spiders, capable of killing humans within hours if untreated. Australia doesn't deploy military forces against funnel web spiders despite their lethality. Instead, there's an anti-venom program and public education about avoiding bites. The proportional response to actual threats demonstrates that governmental decision-making has improved since 1932, at least regarding wildlife management. The Great Barrier Reef's crown of thorns starfish outbreaks create ecological crises that threaten coral systems. These starfish consume coral faster than it can regenerate. The Australian government's response involves manual removal by divers and research into biological controls, rather than attempting military solutions. The crown of thorns problem is more serious ecologically than the 1932 emu situation, but the response is more measured and scientifically informed. Fact number 77. Crown of thorns starfish removal programs employ divers who manually collect starfish from reef systems. This labor-intensive approach is slow and expensive, but actually works without creating worse problems. The contrast with the Emu War is stark. When facing ecological challenges, modern Australia uses appropriate specialised methods rather than assuming military force solves everything. The cane toad problem continues decades after the initial introduction. Current cane toad control methods include trained sniffer dogs, trapping programs, and research into genetic solutions. None of these approaches are glamorous or provide quick results. They're all more effective than military operations would be. Fact number 78. Scientists are researching genetic methods to control cane toads, including gene drives that could reduce breeding success. This represents cutting-edge biological science applied to ecological problems. The research is expensive, slow, and uncertain. It's also the kind of sophisticated approach that might actually work long-term. The lesson from the Emu War and cane toads is that quick, dramatic solutions usually fail, while slow, unglamorous scientific approaches sometimes succeed. Australia's agricultural conflicts with wildlife extend beyond emus to include various bird species that damage crops. Cockatoos, parrots, and other birds cause millions of dollars in crop damage annually. Farmers use non-lethal deterrents, including noisemakers, visual scarers, and netting rather than requesting military intervention. The normalized expectation is that farmers manage wildlife damage through agricultural methods rather than governmental force. Fact number 79. Modern Australian farmers accept some level of crop loss to wildlife as inevitable cost of agriculture. This acceptance represents cultural shift from the 1932 mindset that demanded complete elimination of pest species. Insurance programs and subsidies help farmers absorb losses. The social contract has changed. Government provides financial support for managing wildlife conflicts rather than deploying soldiers to kill animals. The political dynamics around the Emu War reveal interesting patterns about how democracies respond to pressure from rural constituencies. The soldier-settler farmers who requested military help were voters in marginal electoral districts. The government's decision to deploy forces reflected political calculation about maintaining rural support during the Depression. The operation failed practically, but might have succeeded politically by demonstrating governmental responsiveness. Fact number 80. Electoral politics in Australia's federal system gave rural regions disproportionate political influence in the 1930s. The National Party representing rural interests could make or break coalition governments. The Emu War can be understood as the government buying political support from rural voters by demonstrating action on their concerns. The fact that the action was ineffective mattered less than the symbolic gesture of deploying military resources to help farmers. The legacy institutions created after the Emu War include better coordination between agricultural departments and wildlife management agencies. The Council for Scientific and Industrial Research, later CSIRO, expanded its research into sustainable agriculture and pest control. These institutional developments happened gradually, but they created frameworks for addressing human-wildlife conflicts without military deployment. Fact number 81. CSIRO's research into emu biology and behavior eventually produced recommendations for managing emu crop conflicts through timing of planting, strategic fencing, and habitat modification. This scientific approach took decades to develop, but provided actually useful guidance for farmers. The research wouldn't have happened without the Emu War highlighting how little was known about emu ecology and behavior. The international comparison of failed military operations against wildlife reveals that Australia isn't unique in attempting absurd solutions to ecological problems. The Soviet Union conducted military operations against wolves, sparrows, and other species with mixed results. China's Four Pests campaign killed billions of sparrows before realizing the ecological catastrophe this created. Military forces worldwide have been deployed against wildlife, usually with poor outcomes. Fact number 82. The pattern across nations and time periods is consistent. Military operations against wildlife fail because military methods are optimized for fighting organized human enemies who respond to conventional tactics. Animals don't respond conventionally. They flee, scatter, adapt, and survive through behaviors evolved over millions of years. No amount of firepower overcomes evolutionary adaptation when the targets won't cooperate by standing still. The economic history of the soldier-settler program reveals structural problems that the Emu War couldn't solve. The land grants given to World War I veterans were often marginal agricultural territory that experienced farmers avoided. The program set inexperienced farmers up for failure by giving them poor land, minimal support, and expecting them to succeed through determination alone. Fact number 83. Many soldier-settler farms failed regardless of emu problems. The land wasn't suitable for intensive wheat farming. The economic conditions during the Depression made profitable farming nearly impossible. The government's response to farm failures was periodic crisis interventions like the Emu War rather than systemic support for sustainable agriculture. The pattern of treating symptoms rather than addressing root causes characterized agricultural policy throughout this period. The water scarcity in Western Australia created additional challenges for both farming and emu populations. Emus congregated in areas with reliable water access, which often overlapped with farmed areas. The competition for water between human agriculture and wildlife contributed to conflict. Modern water management strategies attempt to provide for both agricultural and ecological needs, rather than viewing them as zero-sum competition. Fact number 84. Contemporary Western Australian agriculture uses sophisticated irrigation systems, water recycling, and drought-resistant crop varieties. These technological and agronomic advances reduce human-wildlife conflicts by making farms more resilient to environmental stresses, including wildlife damage. The contrast with 1932 agriculture is dramatic. Modern farming can absorb impacts that would have been catastrophic during the Depression. The social history of rural Australia during the Depression reveals widespread hardship that extended far beyond emu damage to crops. Unemployment in rural areas exceeded urban rates. Farm foreclosures displaced families. Poverty created desperation that made small problems seem catastrophic. The Emu War happened in context of broader social crisis that intensified reactions to agricultural challenges. Fact number 85. Historical accounts from Western Australian farming communities in the 1930s describe conditions of severe poverty, food insecurity, and social desperation. Families were struggling to survive. In this context, emus eating crops wasn't just an agricultural annoyance. It represented potential starvation. The emotional intensity behind requests for military help makes more sense when understood through the lens of Depression-era desperation. The role of masculinity and military identity in the Emu War deserves attention. The soldiers involved were World War I veterans, whose primary adult identity centered on military service. Being defeated by birds threatened their masculine self-conception as capable warriors. The psychological damage might have been worse than physical risks. Fact number 86. Military culture in the 1920s and 1930s emphasized masculine virtues of courage, strength, and victory over enemies. Soldiers derived personal identity from military competence. The Emu War placed these men in situations where their training and identity were useless. They couldn't be brave against emus because emus didn't threaten them. They couldn't demonstrate strength because emus avoided engagement. The whole framework of military masculinity became irrelevant. The media's role in shaping public memory demonstrates the power of narrative framing. The operation could have been remembered as a minor failed agricultural intervention. Instead, it became the Great Emu War, a story of military defeat by birds. The media's choice to frame the operation as war rather than pest control made the failure more memorable and ridiculous. Fact number 87. Newspaper editors in 1932 recognized the comedic potential of framing agricultural pest control as military conflict. The war terminology amplified the absurdity by creating incongruity between serious military language and flightless birds. If media had described the operation as unsuccessful pest control, it might have been forgotten. By calling it a war, media ensured the story would be remembered and retold for generations. The timing of the Emu War relative to global events adds ironic context. In 1932, Europe was sliding toward fascism and another world war. The League of Nations was failing to maintain peace. International tensions were rising, and Australia was deploying military forces against emus. The contrast between global crisis and local absurdity highlights how nations can focus on trivial problems while missing larger threats. Fact number 88. In the same year Australia fought emus, Adolf Hitler was gaining power in Germany. Japan was invading Manchuria. The global economic depression was deepening. International fascism was rising. Australia's government apparently had attention to spare for machine gunning birds, while the world order collapsed. The Emu War's timing makes it seem even more ridiculous when placed in broader historical context. The technological limitations of 1932 communications meant that coordinating emu hunting across vast territories was nearly impossible. Without radios, telephones in remote areas, or any real-time communication technology, soldiers operated in isolation. Modern wildlife management uses GPS tracking, drones, and digital communication to coordinate operations across large areas. The technological gap explains some of the 1932 failure. Fact number 89. If 1932 soldiers had possessed modern communication and surveillance technology, they might have been more effective at locating and engaging emu populations. GPS tracking of emu movements, drone surveillance of mob locations, and coordinated multi-team operations might have improved results, or maybe not. Technology helps execution but doesn't fix fundamentally flawed strategy. Better tools for bad ideas just create expensive failures instead of cheap ones. The environmental conditions in Western Australia during 1932 included drought cycles that intensified human-wildlife conflict. Limited water and food resources forced emus into farmed areas. During wetter years with abundant natural vegetation, emus stayed in wilderness areas away from farms. The Emu War happened during a convergence of economic depression, agricultural failure, and environmental stress. Fact number 90. Climate cycles in Western Australia alternate between wet years with abundant vegetation and dry years with scarce resources. The early 1930s were relatively dry, pushing emu populations toward areas with reliable water and food, which meant farms. The environmental context made conflict more likely. Modern climate science and weather forecasting allow better prediction of when human-wildlife conflicts will intensify, enabling proactive management rather than crisis response. The comparison between the Emu War and modern drone warfare reveals interesting parallels and differences. Both involve asymmetric conflicts where technological superiority doesn't guarantee victory. Drones can strike targets with precision, but struggle against dispersed mobile populations who blend into civilian areas. Emus dispersed across vast territory and blended into the landscape. The tactics differ, but the strategic challenge is similar. Fact number 91. Military theorists studying asymmetric warfare sometimes reference the Emu War as an early example of how mobility and dispersion defeat concentrated firepower. The emus didn't plan this strategy. It emerged from instinctive anti-predator behaviors, but the effect was the same as deliberate guerrilla tactics. When your opponent won't mass for battle and can't be decisively engaged, superior weapons become less relevant. The agricultural science that could have prevented the Emu War existed in 1932, but wasn't widely applied. Crop rotation, strategic planting times, buffer zones, and diversified farming could have reduced emu damage while maintaining agricultural productivity. These agronomic practices were known but not adopted by soldier-settler farmers who lacked agricultural training. Fact number 92. The knowledge gap between agricultural science and actual farming practice contributed to the emu crisis. Universities and agricultural research stations understood sustainable farming methods. Individual farmers, especially inexperienced soldier settlers, didn't have access to this knowledge or resources to implement it. The Emu War reflected institutional failures in agricultural extension and farmer education as much as it reflected emu populations. The post-Emu War period saw gradual improvement in agricultural support systems. Government agencies expanded extension services, bringing scientific knowledge to farmers. Subsidies helped farmers adopt better practices. Rural infrastructure improved. These changes happened slowly over decades, but they reduced the kinds of agricultural crises that had made the Emu War seem necessary. Fact number 93. By the 1950s, Western Australian agriculture had transformed through mechanisation, improved crop varieties, better water management, and scientific farming practices. The region that had struggled with emu damage in 1932 became productive agricultural territory. The transformation didn't happen through eliminating emus, but through making agriculture resilient enough to coexist with wildlife. Technology and knowledge solved problems that force couldn't. The philosophical question raised by the Emu War concerns the limits of human control over nature. The operation represented a worldview that assumed nature could be conquered through application of sufficient force. The failure suggested that nature operates according to principles that don't respond to human concepts of power and domination. Emus continued being emus regardless of military intervention. Fact number 94. The Enlightenment worldview that European settlers brought to Australia assumed that rational humans could master nature through science and technology. The Emu War tested this assumption and found it wanting. You can't master what you don't understand. The soldiers didn't understand emu ecology, behavior, or population dynamics. They applied force to a problem that required knowledge. The failure was epistemological as much as tactical. The cultural memory of the Emu War serves different functions for different groups. For Australians, it's a source of self-deprecating humour and national character. For military historians, it's a case study in mission failure. For ecologists, it's an example of why wildlife management requires scientific understanding. For political scientists, it demonstrates how crisis decision-making can bypass rational analysis. Fact number 95. The Emu War appears in Australian school curricula as part of national history education. Students learn about it alongside more serious historical events. The pedagogical purpose is teaching critical thinking about governmental decision-making and environmental management. The story is ridiculous enough to be memorable while containing genuine lessons about overconfidence, inappropriate use of force, and the importance of understanding problems before attempting solutions. The counterfactual history where the Emu War succeeded is interesting to imagine. Suppose the soldiers had killed 20,000 emus quickly and efficiently. The farmers would have been happy temporarily, but emu populations would have recovered within years because the fundamental ecological conditions hadn't changed. The region would still have been marginal farmland with periodic droughts. The success would have been temporary, potentially encouraging more military interventions and future wildlife conflicts. Fact number 96. If the Emu War had succeeded, it might have established a precedent for military wildlife management that would have led to greater ecological disasters. Australia might have deployed soldiers against kangaroos, wombats, wallabies, and other native animals causing agricultural problems. The cumulative ecological damage from sustained military hunting campaigns would have been catastrophic. The failure, while embarrassing, prevented potentially worse outcomes by making military wildlife management politically impossible. The legacy of the Emu War in Australian popular culture includes references in films, television shows, books, and internet content. The story has been retold countless times in various formats, each version emphasizing different aspects. Some treatments focus on the comedy, others on the ecological lessons, still others on the human tragedy of Depression-era farmers desperate for help. Fact number 97. The Emu War has its own Wikipedia page in multiple languages, has been the subject of numerous YouTube documentaries, and regularly trends on social media when people discover the story for the first time. The phrase "Australia lost a war to emus" is a recurring internet meme. The story's persistence in popular culture ensures that new generations continue learning about governmental overreach and ecological mismanagement through this accessible historical example. The modern Australian government's official position on the Emu War, when asked, is typically good-humoured acknowledgement that it happened, it was ridiculous, and lessons were learned. This response demonstrates sophisticated public relations. Historical failures can't be erased, but they can be reframed as learning experiences that contributed to current competence. Fact number 98. When Australian Prime Ministers are asked about the Emu War during international press conferences, they typically respond with self-deprecating humour, while noting that modern Australia has better wildlife management practices. This approach turns potential embarrassment into endearing national character. It shows that Australia can laugh at its own mistakes while demonstrating that current policies are based on science rather than sending soldiers with machine guns after birds. The final bizarre fact about the Great Emu War is that, despite its spectacular failure by every measurable standard, the operation achieved a strange kind of success through becoming unforgettable. Military victories are often forgotten after a few generations. The Emu War, a military defeat by birds, has become immortal. Future historians will study it, comedians will reference it, teachers will use it as an example. The operation failed to kill emus, but succeeded at becoming one of history's most memorable governmental failures. Fact number 99. The Great Emu War of 1932 lasted approximately 6 weeks, involved fewer than 10 military personnel, consumed nearly 10,000 rounds of ammunition, killed roughly 1,000 emus out of an estimated 20,000, and accomplished nothing strategically or economically. It generated international mockery, created a lasting cultural legacy, and ensured that no military force would ever again be deployed against Australian wildlife. The operation was a complete failure by every standard except entertainment value and educational utility, and perhaps that's the ultimate bizarre fact. Sometimes spectacular failures teach more than quiet successes. The Emu War failed so perfectly that it became immortal. The story of the Great Emu War tells us something important about human nature and institutional decision-making. When faced with complex problems, humans often default to familiar solutions, even when those solutions are inappropriate. The Australian government knew how to deploy military forces. They didn't know how to manage human-wildlife conflicts in Depression-era agricultural settings. So, they deployed military forces because that was what they knew how to do. The soldiers involved did their best with impossible orders. They showed up, followed instructions, adapted tactics when initial approaches failed, and maintained professional discipline throughout an absurd assignment. Their failure wasn't due to incompetence. It was due to being asked to solve a wildlife management problem using military methods designed for completely different purposes. The farmers who requested military help were desperate people facing genuine hardships during catastrophic economic conditions. Their crops were being destroyed, their families were struggling. They asked their government for help and received a solution that was simultaneously dramatic and useless. They deserved better. The emus were just emus. They didn't know they were in a war. They responded to stimuli according to millions of years of evolutionary programming. When they heard loud noises and saw humans, they fled. This behavior, perfected over countless generations of avoiding predators, proved more effective than military tactics perfected over centuries of human warfare. And that's the final lesson. Nature doesn't care about human concepts of power, technology, or military might. Emus operated according to ecological and evolutionary principles that were completely orthogonal to military strategy. The soldiers brought overwhelming firepower to a conflict where firepower was irrelevant. They couldn't intimidate emus into surrendering. They couldn't break the emu's will to resist because emus don't have will in the human sense. They have instincts. The Great Emu War demonstrates that some problems can't be solved by force, regardless of how much force you apply. Some situations require understanding, patience, and working with natural systems rather than against them. The Australian government eventually learned this lesson, though it took decades and numerous failures beyond just the emus. Modern Australia manages human-wildlife conflicts through science, ecology, and recognition that humans share the continent with unique species that evolve separately from the rest of the world. It's not perfect. Conflicts still happen, animals still damage crops, and occasionally hurt people. But the response framework has evolved from send in the soldiers to how do we coexist sustainably. That transformation from confrontation to coexistence represents genuine progress. The Emu War was a necessary failure that made future better decisions possible. The embarrassment of losing to birds was painful enough to force institutional change. Sometimes you need to fail spectacularly before you're willing to try completely different approaches. So, when you hear about the Great Emu War, remember it's not just a funny story about military incompetence. It's a story about human limitations, ecological complexity, and the painful process of learning to work with nature instead of trying to conquer it. The emus won, not because they were smarter or stronger, but because they were perfectly adapted to their environment in ways that made human military intervention irrelevant. The broader implications of the Emu War extend far beyond Australia and far beyond wildlife management. The story resonates because it captures something universal about human institutions, technological confidence, and the gap between what we think we can control and what we actually can control. Every government, every military, every bureaucracy has its own version of the Emu War waiting to happen when overconfidence meets complexity. The pattern repeats throughout history. Powerful institutions facing problems they don't understand deploy the tools they do understand, regardless of whether those tools are appropriate. The United States spent 2 decades in Afghanistan trying to build a Western-style democracy using military force, eventually withdrawing in failure. The Soviet Union spent a decade in Afghanistan before that, with similar results. The British Empire spent centuries trying to impose its systems on cultures and environments they didn't comprehend. The Emu War is just the most absurdly compressed version of this recurring pattern. What makes the Emu War special is the purity of the example. There's no moral complexity to cloud the lesson. The emus weren't terrorists or insurgents or ideological opponents. They were birds eating crops. The soldiers weren't corrupt or incompetent or evil. They were professionals doing their best with bad orders. The failure was structural, institutional, and completely avoidable if anyone had stopped to ask whether military force was the right approach. The question that haunts every retelling of the Emu War is simple. How did multiple intelligent people, each competent in their own domains, collectively decide that machine guns were the solution to agricultural pest problems? The answer reveals uncomfortable truths about how institutions make decisions under pressure. Nobody explicitly decided that machine guns were ideal for emu control. They decided that something had to be done, that military force was available, and that deploying it would look decisive. This is how bad decisions happen in organizations, not through malice or stupidity, but through a series of small, reasonable-seeming steps that collectively produce absurdity. The farmers needed help. The government wanted to show responsiveness. The military had soldiers and weapons. Each step made sense individually. The combination was ridiculous, but by the time the operation started, institutional momentum made questioning the basic premise difficult. The political economy of the Emu War reveals another universal pattern. Governments facing economic crises often prefer visible, dramatic actions to effective, boring solutions. Military deployment is visible and dramatic. Agricultural extension services, scientific research, and infrastructure investment are boring and slow. During the Depression, the Australian government needed to be seen doing something for struggling farmers. Machine guns looked more impressive than agronomists, even though agronomists would have been more useful. This preference for dramatic visible action over effective invisible work persists in modern governance. Politicians still announce wars on abstract concepts: war on drugs, war on terror, war on poverty. The military metaphor implies that problems can be defeated through sufficient application of force and resources. Sometimes this works, often it doesn't. The Emu War reminds us that declaring war on something doesn't mean military methods will be effective against it. The ecological lessons from the Emu War have applications far beyond emu management. The operation demonstrated that you can't solve ecosystem problems by simply removing one species you find inconvenient. Emus were part of Western Australian ecosystems for millions of years. They filled ecological niches, dispersed seeds, created habitat disturbances that other species depended on, and participated in complex food webs. Eliminating them would have created cascading changes that might have caused worse problems than crop damage. Modern conservation biology understands this complexity. Remove wolves from an ecosystem and deer populations explode, destroying vegetation. Remove sea otters and sea urchins, devastate kelp forests. Remove bees and agricultural productivity collapses. Ecosystems are interconnected networks where changing one component affects everything else. The 1932 Australian government didn't understand this because ecological science barely existed yet. Modern governments have less excuse for making similar mistakes. The Emu War also illustrates the problem of treating symptoms rather than root causes. Emus were eating crops because European agricultural methods had been imposed on environments unsuitable for intensive farming. The real problem was attempting to grow wheat on marginal land during drought years, using techniques developed for completely different climates. Killing emus wouldn't have made the land more suitable for wheat farming. It would have just removed one symptom of the underlying mismatch between agricultural methods and environmental reality. This pattern of symptomatic treatment pervades governmental responses to complex problems. Homelessness is visible and uncomfortable, so governments clear homeless camps rather than addressing the economic and social failures that create homelessness. Drug addiction causes crime, so governments imprison addicts rather than addressing the conditions that drive addiction. Treating symptoms is easier and more visible than fixing root causes. The Emu War is an extreme example of this tendency taken to absurd lengths. The human cost of the Emu War is easy to overlook amid the comedy. Real farmers were struggling to feed their families during the worst economic crisis in modern history. They asked for help and received a publicity stunt that accomplished nothing while making them the butt of international jokes. The Depression-era context matters. These weren't wealthy landowners complaining about minor inconveniences. These were desperate people watching their livelihoods destroyed while government deployed inadequate theatrical solutions. The soldiers involved also deserve consideration. These were World War I veterans who'd survived genuine horrors. They'd seen friends die in trenches, faced artillery barrages and poison gas, and returned home expecting some kind of reward for their service. Instead, they got marginal farmland and orders to shoot birds. Then they got blamed for failing at an impossible task. The psychological cost of the Emu War to these men is undocumented, but probably significant. Major Meredith filed honest reports about the operation's failures and the tactical challenges of hunting emus. He could have written face-saving reports that blamed subordinates or external factors. Instead, he documented that the emus had developed effective counter-tactics and that military methods were unsuitable for the mission. This honesty probably didn't help his career, but it provided valuable information about why the operation failed. Institutional honesty about failure is rare and valuable. The media's role in the Emu War's legacy demonstrates the power of free press to hold government accountable through mockery. Authoritarian governments don't face sustained ridicule when they make stupid decisions, because criticism gets suppressed. Democratic governments with free press face sustained mockery that creates political pressure for better decisions in the future. The Australian media's treatment of the Emu War was merciless, but served important democratic function. However, media coverage also simplified a complex situation into a simple narrative of governmental incompetence. The nuance about Depression-era desperation, the genuine agricultural crisis, and the limited options available to policymakers got lost in comedy. This is the tension in democratic governance. Accountability through criticism is necessary, but oversimplification through media narratives can obscure the actual complexity of governmental decision-making. The international dimension of the Emu War reveals Australia's complicated relationship with its British imperial heritage. The British press found it hilarious that colonial Australians couldn't defeat birds. This mockery carried undertones of imperial superiority. Look at these colonials fumbling basic tasks. The Australian sensitivity to international criticism partly stemmed from ongoing efforts to establish national identity separate from British domination. The Emu War embarrassment reinforced Australian inferiority complex relative to the metropole. Modern Australia has outgrown this colonial inferiority complex. The country now responds to Emu War questions with confident self-deprecation rather than defensive embarrassment. This represents psychological maturity at national level. Secure nations can laugh at their own historical failures. Insecure nations can't admit mistakes without feeling threatened. Australia's evolution from defensive to humorous about the Emu War mirrors its evolution toward confident, independent national identity. The scientific legacy of the Emu War includes genuine advances in ornithology and wildlife management. Dominic Saventi's observations during the operation contributed to understanding emu behavior and ecology. Subsequent research built on this foundation to develop effective wildlife management strategies. Sometimes failures generate valuable data even when they accomplish nothing practically. The Emu War's contribution to science was accidental but real. The agricultural transformation of Western Australia in decades following the Emu War validates the lesson that knowledge and technology solve problems better than force. The same regions that struggled with emu damage in 1932 became productive agricultural zones through improved irrigation, better crop varieties, mechanization, and scientific farming practices. This transformation happened through patient application of agronomic knowledge, not through eliminating emus. The contrast couldn't be clearer. Climate change creates new versions of human-wildlife conflicts that the Emu War's lessons apply to. As temperatures rise and precipitation patterns shift, animals move into new territories seeking suitable habitat. This creates conflicts with human land use. The temptation to solve these conflicts through elimination of inconvenient species remains strong. The Emu War reminds us that such approaches usually fail, and that adaptation and coexistence are more sustainable than confrontation. The Emu War's place in Australian identity formation is significant. National identities are built partly through shared stories that encapsulate values and character. Australia's national story emphasizes traits like resilience, humour, and irreverence toward authority. The Emu War fits perfectly into this narrative. It's a story about governmental authority being defeated by nature, about the importance of practical knowledge over institutional power, and about finding humour in failure. The story also reinforces Australian cultural values around egalitarianism and skepticism of pretension. The military represents hierarchy and formal authority. Emus represent unpretentious nature, just doing what emus do. The emus's victory represents the triumph of authenticity over institutional pomposity. This resonates with Australian cultural preferences for informal directness over formal hierarchy. The Emu War appears in comparative studies of governmental failure across different political systems. Democracies and autocracies both make stupid decisions, but they fail differently. Democratic failures like the Emu War become public embarrassments that generate political accountability. Autocratic failures get covered up or blamed on scapegoats without systemic learning. The Emu War's public documentation and subsequent mockery represent democratic failure modes that, while painful, create pressure for improvement. The economic cost-benefit analysis of the Emu War remains instructive for modern policy evaluation. The operation cost more than the problem it addressed. The resources consumed could have been better allocated to direct agricultural support, infrastructure, or research. Modern policy analysis uses sophisticated cost-benefit frameworks to prevent such obviously wasteful allocations. The Emu War happened partly because such analytical frameworks didn't exist in 1932 governmental practice. However, modern governments still sometimes ignore cost-benefit analysis for political reasons. When analysis shows a proposed policy is wasteful but politically popular, politicians often proceed anyway. The analytical tools to prevent Emu War-type failures exist. The political will to use them consistently doesn't always exist. The tension between rational analysis and political pressure persists. The technological determinism implicit in the Emu War decision-making remains common in modern governance. The assumption that superior technology automatically produces superior outcomes pervades policy discussions. The Emu War demonstrates that technology without appropriate application produces expensive failures. Modern equivalents include using advanced military technology in counterinsurgency operations, or applying high-tech solutions to social problems that require human understanding and relationship building. The Emu War's lesson about the limits of force applies to contemporary conflicts. Military force excels at specific tasks like defeating organized enemy forces in conventional battle. It performs poorly at tasks like building stable governance, winning hearts and minds, or changing deeply rooted social patterns. The disconnect between military capabilities and mission requirements that doomed the Emu War appears repeatedly in modern military operations, where force proves insufficient for achieving political objectives. The environmental ethics implications of the Emu War connect to ongoing debates about human relationships relationships with nature. The 1932 approach viewed emus as pests to be eliminated for human convenience. Modern environmental ethics recognizes intrinsic value in native species and ecosystems beyond human utility. Emus have value as components of Australian ecosystems, regardless of whether they're convenient for farmers. This ethical evolution represents progress from the Emu War's instrumental view of nature. The story's persistence in popular culture demonstrates the power of narrative in transmitting historical lessons. Dry policy analysis of governmental wildlife management failures wouldn't reach mass audiences. The Emu War's inherent absurdity makes it memorable and shareable. The story spreads because it's entertaining, but it teaches genuine lessons about institutional failure, ecological complexity, and the limits of force. Entertainment and education aren't mutually exclusive. The generational transmission of the Emu War story ensures that future Australians will continue learning from this failure. Children hear the story, find it funny, and remember it into adulthood. Teachers use it in classrooms because students pay attention to stories about military forces losing to birds. This pedagogical utility means the Emu War will probably be remembered longer than many genuinely important historical events that were less absurd. The comparative analysis between the Emu War and successful wildlife management programs reveals key differences. Successful programs involve long-term commitment, scientific understanding, community engagement, and appropriate methodology. The Emu War involved short-term military deployment, minimal ecological understanding, no community engagement beyond initial requests for help, and completely inappropriate methodology. The contrast provides clear guidance for how to address human-wildlife conflicts effectively. The question of whether the Emu War could happen again in modern Australia is worth considering. The specific scenario of deploying soldiers with machine guns against emus seems unlikely, but the underlying pattern of applying inappropriate solutions to complex problems under political pressure remains entirely possible. The institutional memory of the Emu War provides some protection against exact repetition, but it doesn't prevent different versions of the same fundamental mistake. Modern equivalents might involve deploying police to solve homelessness, using military solutions for drug problems, or applying technological fixes to social issues requiring human connection. The form changes, but the pattern persists. Institutions default to familiar tools, even when those tools are wrong for the problem. The Emu War's lesson is vigilance against this tendency, not confidence that it can't recur. The role of expertise in the Emu War's failure highlights ongoing tensions between technical experts and political decision-makers. Agricultural scientists and wildlife experts could have explained why military operations wouldn't solve emu problems. Whether they were consulted and ignored, or simply not consulted at all, isn't clear from available records. Either way, expert knowledge didn't inform decision-making. This pattern of policy being made without adequate expert input remains depressingly common. The counterexample of CSIRO's eventual development of scientific wildlife management approaches demonstrates what happens when expertise does inform policy. Research-based recommendations for managing emu crop conflicts through habitat modification, timing of planting, and strategic fencing proved far more effective than machine guns. The time lag between the Emu War failure and the development of effective alternatives shows how long it takes to build scientific knowledge and institutional capacity. The international resonance of the Emu War story suggests it captures something universal about human institutional behavior. People worldwide find the story compelling, not just because it's absurd, but because it reflects patterns they recognize from their own societies. Every nation has examples of governmental overreach, misapplied technology, and confident ignorance producing failure. The Emu War is just an unusually pure and well-documented example. The story's uses in political rhetoric demonstrate its power as metaphor. Calling a proposed policy an Emu War immediately communicates that it's an overreaction using inappropriate means. The metaphor works because the story is widely known and the lesson is clear. This rhetorical utility ensures the story's continued circulation in political discourse beyond its historical significance. The preservation of official records from the Emu War enables ongoing historical analysis and reinterpretation. As new theoretical frameworks and analytical tools develop, historians can revisit the same primary sources and extract new insights. Future historians might analyze the Emu War through frameworks we haven't developed yet, finding lessons we haven't recognized. This is the value of thorough documentation, even of embarrassing failures. The ethical questions raised by the Emu War about animal welfare and ecological disruption were not central to 1932 discourse, but are central to modern understanding. Current environmental ethics would question whether humans have the right to exterminate native species for agricultural convenience. The Emu War happened before such ethical frameworks were widely accepted, but modern retelling of the story often incorporates these concerns. The class dimensions of the Emu War deserve attention. Wealthy landowners and agricultural corporations had resources to manage wildlife damage through fencing, hired hunters, and crop insurance. Poor soldier-settler farmers didn't have these resources and turned to government for help. The government's response was theatrical rather than effective, which meant the burden of wildlife damage fell disproportionately on those least able to absorb it. This pattern of inadequate governmental support for economically vulnerable populations persists. The Emu War's role in environmental education extends beyond Australia. The story appears in ecology textbooks internationally as an example of why understanding ecosystems matters before intervening. It's taught alongside other examples of well-intentioned interventions creating worse problems. The pedagogical value crosses national boundaries because the lessons about ecological complexity are universal. The relationship between the Emu War and Australian military identity is complex. The operation represents one of the few clear defeats in Australian military history. Most Australian military operations have been either victories or at least not obvious failures. The Emu War stands out as unambiguous defeat, which makes it problematic for national military mythology, while useful for teaching humility about military limitations. The counterfactual scenarios where different decisions produce different outcomes are instructive. If the government had deployed agricultural experts instead of soldiers, farmers would have received useful guidance about managing wildlife damage. If resources spent on ammunition had been spent on fencing or crop insurance, farmers would have received material help. The opportunity cost of the Emu War represents resources that could have been used effectively elsewhere. The long-term economic development of Western Australia vindicated the decision not to continue military operations against emus. The region developed into productive agricultural territory by adapting farming practices to local conditions rather than attempting to eliminate local wildlife. This adaptation required decades and significant investment, but it produced sustainable results that eliminating emus never could have achieved. The Emu War's influence on Australian popular culture includes references in music, literature, and comedy beyond simple historical recounting. Artists use the story as metaphor for Australian experiences of colonial inadequacy, environmental misunderstanding, and the triumph of nature over human pretension. These artistic reinterpretations keep the story alive while adding layers of meaning beyond the historical facts. The comparison between how Australia and other nations handled similar wildlife conflicts reveals interesting differences. New Zealand's approach to introduce species has been more aggressive and in some cases more successful, though also more ethically controversial. North American approaches to predator control have evolved through similar patterns of failure and learning. The Emu War is part of a global pattern of humans gradually learning to coexist with wildlife rather than attempting complete dominance. The bureaucratic aftermath of the Emu War likely included policy reviews, budget analysis, and administrative recommendations that were never published publicly. The internal governmental response to the failure probably shaped future decisions about when military deployment was appropriate. This institutional learning happened quietly without public acknowledgement, which is how most governmental adaptation occurs. The story's value as a cultural memory check against governmental overreach should not be underestimated. When Australian governments propose dramatic solutions to complex problems, the cultural memory of the Emu War provides a reference point for skepticism. This cultural immune system against certain types of governmental excess is worth preserving, even if it means perpetually retelling an embarrassing story. The final reflection on the Emu War must acknowledge both its comedy and its tragedy. Yes, it's funny that soldiers lost to birds, but behind that comedy are real people who suffered, farmers who lost crops and livelihoods, veterans who were given impossible missions and blamed for failure, government officials who made bad decisions under pressure, the emus themselves, thousands of which were killed in an ultimately futile operation. The humour shouldn't erase the human cost. The wisdom gained from the Emu War came at significant expense. The monetary cost of ammunition and military deployment, the opportunity cost of resources that could have been used more effectively, the political cost of international embarrassment, the psychological cost to participants. The question is whether modern societies have internalized these lessons enough to avoid paying similar costs for similar failures. What has changed is the speed and reach of information. The Emu War became international news within weeks, but the full story took months to circulate. Modern governmental failures become global knowledge within hours through social media. This accelerated information flow creates faster feedback loops for accountability. Governments can't hide failures as easily. The role of individual responsibility in institutional failures like the Emu War is worth examining. Nobody involved was individually responsible for the total failure. Each person made defensible choices within their role and constraints. The collective outcome was disaster, but individual culpability is distributed and diluted. This makes learning from failure difficult because there's no clear villain to blame and remove. The lesson has to be absorbed institutionally. The Emu War demonstrates that institutional learning is slow and uncertain. The Australian government didn't immediately develop perfect wildlife management policies after the operation ended. They continued making mistakes over decades as institutional knowledge accumulated and cultural attitudes evolved. This slow pace means that each generation risks repeating previous failures if cultural memory fades. The question of forgiveness for historical failures is relevant. Should modern Australia continue flagellating itself over a 90-year-old wildlife management mistake? The answer seems to be a middle path. Acknowledge the failure, learn from it, laugh at it, but don't let it define contemporary identity. This balanced approach allows historical mistakes to inform present decisions without paralyzing action through fear of failure. The Emu War's lessons about the limits of control apply broadly to human existence. We can't control nature through will and force alone. We can't solve complex ecological problems with simple violent solutions. We can't substitute technology for understanding. These lessons extend beyond wildlife management to every domain where humans interact with systems we don't fully comprehend. The parallel between the Emu War and modern challenges like climate change is worth noting. Both involve human activity disrupting ecosystems. Both tempt policymakers toward dramatic visible actions rather than sustained patient effort. Both require understanding complex systems. Both demonstrate that nature operates according to its own logic regardless of human preferences. The difference is scale, but the underlying dynamic is similar. The optimistic reading of the Emu War is that humans can learn from failures and adapt. Australia did eventually develop effective wildlife management. The immediate failure led to long-term improvement. This suggests hope that humanity can learn from environmental failures and adapt before it's too late. The pessimistic reading is that humans only learn through failure, and some failures are too catastrophic to learn from. The Emu War was survivable. Climate change might not be. Relying on post-failure learning for existential threats is dangerous. Humanity needs better mechanisms for learning from predicted failures before they occur. The cultural production around the Emu War continues generating new interpretations. Modern artists, writers, and filmmakers find new meanings in the old story. Each generation sees different aspects as relevant to their contemporary concerns. This ongoing reinterpretation keeps the story alive and allows it to serve multiple pedagogical purposes. The story's appeal to different political perspectives is interesting. Conservatives can use it to criticize governmental overreach. Progressives can use it to criticize environmental mismanagement. The story's political flexibility ensures its continued circulation across ideological boundaries. The final assessment of the Emu War must balance multiple truths. It was a failure by military, economic, and ecological standards. It was also a source of valuable lessons about institutional decision-making and the limits of force. It caused real suffering while providing enduring education. It was simultaneously ridiculous and instructive, embarrassing and valuable, absurd and profound. The emus of Western Australia today continue their lives unaware of their ancestors' role in military history. They migrate, breed, feed, and die according to patterns established over millions of years. Human agriculture continues in the same regions, more sophisticated than in 1932, but still facing challenges. The coexistence isn't perfect, but it works well enough that nobody seriously proposes deploying soldiers with machine guns. That pragmatic coexistence represents the real victory emerging from the Emu War's failure. Not the triumph of humans over nature or nature over humans, but the development of approaches that allow both to exist in the same landscapes. This isn't a dramatic victory that generates exciting stories. It's a boring, sustainable compromise that actually works. The story of the Great Emu War will continue being told as long as Australia exists as a nation, and probably longer. It's too perfect a story to fade, too absurd to forget, too instructive to abandon. Future historians will study it. Future comedians will reference it. Future teachers will use it. The emus won the war, but humanity won the lessons. And perhaps that's the best possible outcome from a failure, not erasure or forgetting, but transformation into permanent cultural knowledge. So there you have it. 99 bizarre facts about the time Australia went to war with emus and lost. History is full of military victories and defeats. This one stands alone. Sometimes the greatest lessons come from the most ridiculous failures. Sleep well, knowing somewhere emus are still winning.